Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about the Neoclassicals. Now, Neoclassicism is really more of an artistic and literary movement than it necessarily is a school of critical reading or a literary or cultural studies discipline. But because the Neoclassicals gave us a distinctive approach to reading, I do actually want to include them in this series. So the Neoclassicals were sort of slightly post-Renaissance movement. If we think of the height of the Renaissance as being sort of late 1400s, mid 1400s, up through the mid 1600s or so, the Neoclassicals really pick up from there. So starting around 1660, the Restoration in the UK of Charles II in Britain, the court of Louis XIV in France, this sort of era, late 1600s into the 1700s, and then really sort of getting challenged and replaced by Romanticism in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. So what were the Neoclassicals all about? Essentially, they built on the Renaissance era rediscovery of classical materials, Greco-Roman materials primarily. So writers like Aristotle, like Plato, like Cicero, like Seneca, etc., etc. These Greek and Roman philosophers, artists, dramatists, etc., etc. The Neoclassicals were fascinated by these people. And one of the big questions for the Neoclassicals was whether the ancients were just better across the board than the moderns. Like, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of this period about the conflict between the ancients and the moderns. So this is a big preoccupation for them. And that mostly ends up shaping literary and artistic approaches. And actually, I think the Bedford Glossary of Critical and Literary Terms gives a really good sense of this. Because it says here, Neoclassicism stressed rules, reason, harmony, balance, restraint, decorum, order, serenity, realism, and form. Above all, an appeal to the intellect rather than emotion. So these are the sort of central things that they're interested in. And what the Neoclassicals find in ancient Greek and Roman sources is a very definite set of rules for understanding the arts, particularly for understanding things like drama, but also for understanding things like poetry, for understanding architecture, for understanding landscaping and things like this. And so everything becomes very formal and rigid. Rigid is maybe the wrong word because that suggests a sort of, I don't know, it's not the wrong word necessarily, but rigid in a particular sense. So the Neoclassicals, for instance, loved gardens laid out in geometric shapes, straight lines and things like this. They loved poetry that had very regular meter. So they're actually big into rhyming couplets in a lot of instances. People like Alexander Pope, for instance, his essay on criticism, which is one of the great sort of major early works of literary philosophy. And it's very concerned with the conflict between the ancients and the moderns as well. But like it's in, I think it's been 7 years, I think, since I read it, but it's in rhyming couplets. I'm reasonably certain all the way throughout. It is these very regular forms and metrical consistency, organization by strict guidelines and things like this. The well-made play in the English tradition, 1700s English drama, has this very rigid form called the well-made play, and they're often not all that good. Any fans of the well-made play out there, I apologize, but they're really not that good. But they follow the rules really, really, really well. The French actually did better. The great classical era of French drama, people like Pierre Corneille, Jean Racine, people like this, they had very rigid sets of rules for how good art should function. The Neoclassicals are the ones who came up with the 3 classical unities of time, that a story, particularly in the theater, should take place within the same space, should take place within a very short amount of time, 1 day at most, and that everything should be connected, basically. Aristotle, if you actually read Aristotle's Poetics, it's not entirely unreasonable to interpret what he says as there should be some sort of unity, but the French really say, boom, rigid structure. You cannot deviate. And indeed, very few French plays from the late 1600s up through even into the 1800s deviate from these formulas. So this gives us a standard for assessing art, architecture, landscaping, painting, theater, poetry, etc., etc. And so that's really the Neoclassicals' big contribution to literary and cultural theory, is this idea that there are specific rules and guidelines for what works and does not work successfully with a particular genre. And that becomes very, very influential. And indeed, almost all artistic movements and literary and cultural movements develop these kinds of ideas about what's good and what's bad artistically. One of the big problems with Neoclassicism as an approach is precisely what the Romantics later claim when they come along, people like Wordsworth, Keats, Goethe, when they come along in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It's intellectual without emotion, right? So if your approach to the layout of your garden is straight lines, geometric angles, a regular pattern, great, you've done something intellectual, but there's no soul to it, right? I mean, this would be sort of the Romantic thing. They like these ideas of like freedom and liberty and, you know, all these. They're not bad things. They're good things. I'm on board with the Romantics, but they're ill-defined things in many ways. They are these sort of aspirational spiritual things. And there's really no room in Neoclassicism for that kind of approach. Like, you can do things that are very, very smart. You can do things that are very, very innovative, as long as you stay within the rules. You can color the coloring book picture any colors you want, provided you stay in the lines. This is the sort of the limitation of neoclassicism in some ways, is it does not know what to make of boundary crossing, of experimental work. So romantic poetry, modernism, for instance. The neoclassicals would not know what to do with modernism. They would simply be incapable of fitting it into a particular box and appreciating its aesthetic value, its philosophical value, because a work like T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland or Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, something like this, would just completely destroy the boundaries, the borders, and the regularity of forms that are so central to the neoclassicals. So again, they give us this they give us, and it's not even necessarily that these sets of rules and guidelines they give us are important, but the idea of defining and structuring regular approaches to art that follow usable and recognizable and comprehensible guidelines. That's a very, very important innovation of the neoclassical period.